Britain is full of doorways that do not make sense. You walk up to a church that has stood since the Norman conquest, and the door comes up to your shoulder. You crouch to step through a medieval gatehouse and find yourself wondering how anyone ever used this thing with dignity. You visit a Roman fort on the northern edge of the empire and notice that the entrance to the garrison headquarters is narrower than the door to your bathroom. These are not accidents of poor craftsmanship. They are not the result of walls settling or stone shifting over centuries. They are intentional. They were built exactly as their builders intended. And what they tell us, if we slow down and pay attention, is that the people who made them were living in bodies that were genuinely different from the bodies we inhabit today. This is a story about doorways, but it is really a story about bodies and time and the quiet archaeology of things we pass through without thinking. The average doorway in a modern British home is just over 2 meters tall. That is 6 feet and 7 inches of clearance, enough for almost anyone to walk through without thinking, enough for the vast majority of people to pass beneath with room to spare. We build them this way because we have decided, through decades of building regulations and ergonomic research and the accumulated habits of industrial construction, that this is what a door should be. Walk into a house built before 1900 and the door shrinks. Not always dramatically, but noticeably. Victorian terraces, the kind that line the streets of Manchester and Birmingham and the older parts of London, tend to have door frames around 6 feet tall. Step into the parlour of a Georgian townhouse and you are looking at something similar. The doors are thinner too. The hallways are narrower. Go back further and the shrinkage becomes more pronounced. A typical doorway in a medieval English hall, the kind of oak-framed opening you might find in a building from the 13th or 14th century, stands somewhere between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall. That is enough for most modern adults to pass through without ducking, but only just. The margin is uncomfortable rather than generous. You are always aware of the frame above your head. In the oldest stone churches, in the Saxon and early Norman buildings that still stand in places like Bradford-on-Avon in Wiltshire or Escombe in County Durham, the doorways are smaller still. Some of them stand barely 5 feet 6 inches high. The opening at Escombe, a church built in the 7th century from stones recycled out of a Roman fort, is narrow and low by any modern standard. People did not stroll through this door. They moved through it with intention. And in the oldest domestic structures, in the reconstructed longhouses of the Iron Age and the Romano-British farmsteads, whose foundations archaeologists have mapped across the British countryside, the entrances are lower still, 5 feet, sometimes less. This is the archaeology of scale, and it is telling us something important. The question of how tall people were in historical Britain is not a simple one, and the answer changes depending on which era you are asking about and which class of people you have in mind. Bones are the most direct evidence we have. When archaeologists excavate burial sites, one of the first things they do is estimate the height of the individual from the length of the long bones, particularly the femur and the tibia. The relationship between bone length and overall stature is well established, and while there is always a margin of error, the estimates are reliable enough to build a picture across centuries. What that picture shows is a population in constant slow fluctuation, rising and falling with the availability of food, the prevalence of disease, and the demands made on the body by hard physical labour. The people of prehistoric Britain, the builders of Stonehenge and the settlers of the Neolithic hill forts, were not dramatically shorter than modern people. Analysis of skeletal remains from the Neolithic period, roughly 4,000 to 2,500 BCE, suggests average male heights of around 5 feet 5 inches, with women averaging around 5 feet 1 inch. These are modest, but not extreme differences from modern averages. The Bronze Age population was similar. The Iron Age, from roughly 800 BCE onward, shows comparable figures. The people who built the round houses and hill forts of pre-Roman Britain were not a race of tiny people. They were shorter than us, but not by a dramatic margin. And then something happened with the Romans. When the Roman legions arrived in Britain in 43 ACE, they brought with them a culture that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably well fed. The Roman military diet was substantial and carefully managed. Soldiers received regular rations of grain, olive oil, and meat. The empire's infrastructure of roads and trade routes meant that food moved efficiently from places of plenty to places of need. A Roman legionary was, by the nutritional standards of his time, a well-nourished individual. The skeletal evidence from Roman Britain reflects this. Analysis of burials from Roman period towns and forts shows that the Roman population, or at least the Romano-British urban population, was slightly taller, on average, than the pre-Roman Iron Age people they had displaced or absorbed. Some researchers put the difference at an inch or two. Others see it as more modest. But the doorways of Roman Britain are not generous by our standards either. At Chester's Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall in Northumberland, the doorways into the various rooms and corridors of the garrison complex average around 5 feet 8 inches. At Vindolanda, the extraordinary fort and civilian settlement that has yielded some of the most remarkable archaeological finds in Britain, the reconstructed doorways stand at similar heights. At the bathhouse in Bath, the original Roman structure beneath centuries of later rebuilding, the openings are proportioned for people who were simply not as tall as we tend to be. The Roman world was not a world of small people. It was a world of people who were on average an inch or two shorter than a modern Western adult and who built their spaces accordingly. After the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, something happened to the island's population that the bones record with quiet precision. The immediate post-Roman period, the era that history books used to call the Dark Ages and now tends to call late antiquity or the early medieval period, was by many measures a time of nutritional crisis. The elaborate infrastructure that had kept Roman towns supplied with food began to break down. The villa system that had organized agricultural production in the countryside dissolved. Population fell. Towns shrank. The sophisticated grain storage and distribution networks that the empire had built simply stopped working. The bones of people buried in the 5th and 6th centuries in Britain are, on average, slightly shorter than those of the Roman period that preceded them. Not dramatically so, but measurably. The average male height in this period falls to somewhere around 5 feet 4 inches. Women average perhaps an inch or two below 5 feet. These are the people who built the first Christian churches in Britain. The small stone and timber structures that began to appear across the island as the new religion spread from the monasteries of Ireland and the continental missions. The doorways of those earliest churches reflect their builders' dimensions. The church at Escombe in County Durham, which we have already mentioned, is one of the best preserved Saxon buildings in England. It was probably built in the late 7th century, and it was built using stone taken from the ruins of the nearby Roman fort at Binchester. The builders were recyclers, which tells us something about the resource constraints of their time. And the building they made is small and low and dark by any modern standard. The nave is barely 5 meters wide. The chancel arch, one of the finest examples of Saxon stone carving to survive in England, springs from a height of not much more than 5 feet. A reasonably tall adult standing in the nave of Escombe Church would find the arch soffit uncomfortably close to the top of their head. This was not a building designed for people like us. There is a particular quality to the experience of standing inside a very old building, a quality that has to do with proportion and scale, with the way the space relates to your body. Modern buildings are built to what architects call the human scale, but the human scale they assume is the modern human scale, the 6-foot man, the ergonomic standard. Very old buildings were built to a different human scale, one that assumed a shorter, narrower body, and standing in them, you feel this difference in a way that is almost physical. The nave of a Saxon church feels intimate, not just because it is small in absolute terms, but because it was built for people who were themselves smaller. The low ceiling does not feel oppressive in the way that a low ceiling in a modern building might feel. It feels sized correctly, but for someone else. This is one of the reasons that very old buildings have the particular quality they do. We are receiving their spaces at the wrong scale. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought another set of builders to Britain, and the Normans were builders of extraordinary ambition. The great cathedrals and castle keeps that went up in the decades following Hastings are among the most impressive structures ever raised in Britain, and they are also among the best documented in terms of their surviving dimensions. Norman doorways are larger than Saxon ones. The Normans brought with them a tradition of elaborate carved stone portal that required a certain minimum height and width, simply to accommodate the decorative program. The round-arched doorways of Norman churches, with their rings of carved chevron and beakhead ornament, needed to be tall enough for the carvings to be visible and meaningful. A tiny doorway could not support a proper tympanum, the semicircular carved panel that typically fills the space above the door and below the arch. So Norman doorways grew, not necessarily because Norman people were taller, but because Norman architectural ambition demanded larger canvases. Even so, the standard Norman doorway in a parish church stands at around 6 feet, perhaps a little more. The great west doors of the major cathedrals are of course much larger, but these are ceremonial openings, not everyday passages. The doors through which ordinary people moved in ordinary life were still modest by our standards. The Normans themselves, the ruling military class that came over with William and settled in England as a new aristocracy, were probably not dramatically taller than the Anglo-Saxon population they had conquered. The evidence from the skeletons of high-status Norman burials suggests men averaging around 5 feet, 7 or 5 feet 8, broadly comparable to what we see in the late Anglo-Saxon period. But here is where things get interesting. Medieval Britain was not a society of uniform diet and uniform height. It was a society of profound nutritional inequality, and the bones record this inequality with considerable precision. Archaeologists who have compared the skeletal remains of high-status medieval individuals with those of low-status individuals from the same period and the same region consistently find a height difference. The wealthy ate better. Better nutrition in childhood means better growth. Better growth means taller adults. The evidence suggests that this gap could be substantial. A high-status medieval male, the kind of person who might be buried in a monastery church or a cathedral close, might average 5 feet 8 or 5 feet 9 inches. A low-status rural labourer from the same century might average 5 feet 4 or 5 feet 5. This matters for understanding doorways because different doors were built for different people. The great hall of a medieval castle, the chamber where the lord received guests and held feasts, had doorways proportioned for the lord and his class. The service entrances, the passages through which servants moved, were typically lower and narrower. The cottages of villeins and serfs had doorways that reflected their inhabitants' smaller average stature. When we look at a medieval doorway today, we need to ask, which kind of door is this? Whose body was it built for? The village of Lecoq in Wiltshire is one of the best preserved medieval villages in England. It is owned by the National Trust and has appeared in more period drama productions than almost anywhere else in the country, precisely because it looks so genuinely old. Walk down its main street and you are looking at buildings that were, in most cases, constructed between the 13th and 15th centuries. The doorways of Lecoq's older buildings are instructive. The doors into the later, higher status buildings, the ones associated with the abbey or with prosperous tradespeople, tend to have frames at around 5 feet 10 to 6 feet. The doors into the smaller cottages, the buildings associated with agricultural labourers and the less prosperous inhabitants of the village tend to be lower, 5 feet 6, sometimes 5 feet 4. These are not ancient ruins. They are working buildings, occupied and maintained over centuries, but they preserve in their proportions an echo of the bodies they were built for, and those bodies were measurably different from the bodies that walk through them today. The question of when, exactly, British people began to get taller is one that historians and anthropologists have been trying to answer for decades, and the answer is both more complicated and more recent than most people expect. The popular assumption is that the Industrial Revolution made things worse before they made things better, and this is broadly true. The early industrial period, the decades from roughly 1760 to 1850, saw significant urban crowding, deteriorating living conditions for the working class, and, crucially, disruptions to food supply that had serious nutritional consequences. The bones from this period, and the records kept by institutions like the military and the prisons, which were assiduous measurers of the bodies in their care, show that average heights actually declined in some segments of the population. Army recruitment records from the late 18th and early 19th centuries are a goldmine of anthropometric data. The military had good reasons to measure its recruits carefully, partly for practical reasons of uniform fitting and partly because there were minimum height requirements for certain units. These records show that the average height of British Army recruits in the Napoleonic era was around 5 feet 6 inches. This is not much taller than the average of 1,000 years earlier. The sustained increase in average British height really only began in the second half of the 19th century, as public health improvements, better urban sanitation, and gradually improving real wages for the working class began to have nutritional effects. By the end of the Victorian era, the average height of adult British men had risen to around 5 feet 7 or 5 feet 8. The really dramatic increase came in the 20th century. The introduction of universal free school meals, improvements in maternal health care, the development of the welfare state, the availability of cheap protein through intensified agriculture, all of these changes meant that British children grew up better nourished than any previous generation, and they grew, accordingly, taller. By the mid-20th century, the average British man stood at around 5 feet 9 or 5 feet 10. Today, the average is just over 5 feet 10 inches, with a substantial proportion of the male population taller than 6 feet. This is not a small change. This is a transformation of the average human body, accomplished over a span of perhaps 3 or 4 generations. And it means that we are now walking through a built environment that was, in its oldest parts, designed for people who were 3 to 4 inches shorter than we are. 3 to 4 inches does not sound like much, but think about what it means in terms of a doorway. If the average medieval male was 5 feet 5 inches tall, and you want your doorway to clear his head with a comfortable margin, you build it to around 5 feet 9 or 5 feet 10 inches. That is exactly what the surviving medieval buildings suggest. If the average modern male is 5 feet 10 inches tall, that same doorway now requires him to duck. Not dramatically, not every time, not if he is paying attention, but the margin has evaporated, the comfort zone has gone, and for people who are taller than the modern average, for the 6'2" men who are now perfectly ordinary in Britain, the medieval doorway is a genuine obstacle. They must duck clearly and deliberately every time they pass through it. There is a particular doorway in the city of York that has been photographed more times than almost any other doorway in England. It is the doorway into the small chapel of the Badern in the city's medieval core, a building that dates to the 14th century. The door is original, or close to original, and it stands at a height that requires any reasonably tall adult to bow noticeably when passing through. This bow is not an accident of preservation or settlement. The building has been surveyed repeatedly, and the door sits precisely where it was always intended to sit. The people who built this chapel built it this way because this was an appropriate height for the people who would use it. Those people were the vicars, choral of York Minster, the junior clergy who lived and worshipped in the Bedern complex. They were not particularly notable for their small stature. They were just medieval people, with medieval bodies, using a space built to medieval dimensions. When modern visitors pass through this doorway, many of them have to bow, and in bowing, they perform a kind of inadvertent genuflection, a bodily acknowledgement of entry into a sacred space that medieval people would not have had to perform because they could simply walk through the door upright. This is, among other things, a slightly poignant image. The architecture imposes a posture on modern bodies that it did not impose on medieval ones. Not all ancient doorways are low, of course. Some of the largest and most magnificent doorways in Britain are also among the oldest. The great west doors of Durham Cathedral, built in the late 11th century, are approximately 12 feet tall. The ceremonial portal of Canterbury Cathedral's north transept, the door known as the Prior's Gate, stands at a similar height. These are not doors sized for any human body. They are doors sized for the idea of the divine, for the grandeur of God and the church that served him. Understanding this distinction is crucial to understanding the history of doorways in Britain. There have always been two parallel traditions of door building, the everyday and the ceremonial, the functional and the symbolic. Everyday doors were sized for the people who would use them. Ceremonial doors were sized for the ideas they were meant to express. The tension between these two traditions runs through the entire history of British architecture. Even in the oldest buildings, you can see it playing out. The great ceremonial entrance of a Roman basilica is a different thing from the service door at the back of the same building. The west front of a Norman cathedral is a different thing from the door into the sacristy. And when we try to read the history of human height from doorways, we need to be careful to distinguish between these two traditions. The ceremonial doors tell us about aspiration and theology and power. The everyday doors tell us about bodies. Let us spend some time with the everyday doors. Let us go to the places where ordinary people lived and worked and slept, and see what those places tell us about the bodies they contained. The reconstructed Iron Age farm at Flag Fen in Cambridgeshire is built on the basis of careful archaeological evidence from the site, which preserves remarkable organic remains because of the waterlogged conditions of the fen. The roundhouses at Flag Fen have entrances that are typically around 5 feet tall, sometimes a little less. They are low enough that an adult of average modern height must duck to enter. The reason for this is partly practical. A low doorway is easier to defend against the wind. Heat stays in, draft stays out. The low lintel of a roundhouse entrance is not primarily an accommodation to human height, but a response to the environment, a way of making a small space warmer and more sheltered. But it works, in its effect, to tell us something about the bodies that used it. Because a doorway that is 5 feet tall and that you build yourself to keep out the wind will be a doorway that you can walk through without stooping if you are 5 feet tall or less. If you are taller, you will stoop, and if you stoop every time you come home, you will build the next house with a higher door. The fact that these doors stayed low tells us that the people using them were not, in general, tall enough to find them inconvenient. The medieval longhouse is a building type that survived, in various forms, from the early medieval period right through to the early modern era, and its remains are found across Britain, particularly in the north and west, where stone was readily available and where the longhouse tradition persisted longest. A longhouse, as the name implies, is a long rectangular building divided into two main sections, a living area for the family at one end and a byre, or animal shelter, at the other. The animal's body heat helped warm the human end of the building. The two sections shared a single roof and often a single entrance, though some longhouses had separate doors for people and animals. The longhouses of Dartmoor, where a remarkable number of medieval examples survive in various states of preservation, offer an excellent opportunity to study everyday medieval domestic architecture at scale. The Dartmoor longhouses date mostly from the 13th and 14th centuries, and their dimensions have been carefully recorded. The main doorways of these houses typically stand between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 8 inches tall. The internal openings, the doorways between the living area and the buyer, are often lower still. In some examples, they barely reach 5 feet. The people who lived in these houses were, by the evidence of their own buildings, quite short. The Dartmoor peasantry of the medieval period was probably not dramatically different in height from the national average of around 5 feet 4 to 5 feet 5 for men. But they were also not tall, and their buildings reflect this with quiet precision. There is something meditative about thinking carefully about doorways. A doorway is one of the most fundamental architectural elements, one of the oldest human inventions. Before people built walls, they did not need doors, but as soon as they began to enclose space, to divide the world into inside and outside, they needed a way to pass between those two conditions. The doorway is the place where inside meets outside. It is the threshold, the liminal zone, the place that is neither here nor there, but both at once. Almost every human culture has developed elaborate symbolic frameworks around the doorway, rituals and superstitions and architectural decorations that mark the significance of the passage. In Britain, as in much of Europe, the doorway has traditionally been a place of apotropaic decoration, a place where protective symbols were inscribed or carved to ward off evil and invite blessing. The carved heads on Norman doorways, the so-called Sheela-na-gig figures found on some medieval churches, the horseshoes nailed above farmhouse doors, all of these are expressions of the same basic belief, that the doorway is a dangerous and important place, and that it needs to be managed with care. But before all of this symbolism, before all of this decoration and ritual, there is the simple physical fact of the doorway. It is a hole in a wall, sized for a body to pass through, and different bodies require different holes. The Romans, as we have noted, were somewhat taller on average than the Saxon population that came after them, but the Romans also had a highly standardized approach to architecture that transcended individual variation. The Roman military built to precise specifications. The dimensions of a standard legionary fort, the layout of its buildings and streets and gates were regulated by the army's engineering manuals and by the practical experience of building hundreds of similar structures across the empire. This standardization is one of the things that makes Roman forts recognizable wherever they are found, from Hadrian's Wall to the Syrian desert. The standard doorway dimensions in a Roman fort reflect this standardization. Internal doorways in the barrack blocks, where the soldiers slept 8 to a room, tend to be around 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet. The main gates of the fort, the portae principales, are of course much larger, built to admit carts and cavalry and siege equipment. But the everyday doors that soldiers used to move between rooms and buildings were sized for the Roman soldier's body. The Roman soldier of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the era of most of the Hadrian's Wall forts, was required to meet a minimum height standard for service in the legions. The sources disagree slightly on what this minimum was, but it was somewhere around 5 feet 6 to 5 feet 8, which in Roman units was expressed as 5 Roman feet. This means that a doorway of 5 feet 10 inches in a legionary barrack provided a comfortable but not extravagant clearance for the typical soldier. He would not need to duck, he would not scrape his helmet, but he would not have a generous margin either. Hadrian's Wall itself, that extraordinary monument to Roman imperial ambition, stretches for 73 miles across the neck of Britain, from the Solway Firth to the Tyne. It was built in the early 2nd century CE on the orders of the Emperor Hadrian, and it represents one of the most impressive feats of military engineering in the ancient world. The wall is, in most places, the height of the people who built it, or rather, the height that was useful and practical given the bodies and capabilities of the people who built it. Modern surveys of the wall's surviving sections and the evidence of its original height suggest it stood somewhere between 4 and 6 meters, enough to be a serious obstacle, but not so tall as to be impossible to build with the materials and technology available. The mile castles, small fortlets placed every Roman mile along the wall's length, have doorways that give us another data point. The gateways of these mile castles are larger than ordinary doorways, because they had to admit pack animals and carts and patrols of soldiers in equipment. But the internal doors, the passages between rooms within the mile castle, are everyday doors, and they are sized at around 5 feet 10 to 6 feet. The soldiers stationed on the wall, the auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire, Rhine Germans and Batavians and Thracians and Syrians, would have found these doors comfortable. The modern visitor, crouching through a narrow mile castle opening, is receiving an accidental lesson in historical anthropometry. Let us move forward in time, past the Romans and past the Saxons, into the medieval period that produced so many of the buildings that still define the British landscape. The 12th century was a period of remarkable architectural creativity in Britain. The Normans, now 3 or 4 generations settled, were building cathedrals and abbeys and castles at a furious pace. The great monastic foundations of this period, places like Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire and Rievaulx Abbey in North Yorkshire, were built with a care and ambition that was unprecedented in post-Roman Britain. The Cistercian monks who built fountains and Rievaulx were famous for their austerity. Their rule discouraged the elaborate decoration that characterized Norman and Romanesque architecture elsewhere. Cistercian buildings were stripped of ornament, functional and severe, and their doorways were sized for exactly the bodies that would use them without any addition of ceremonial grandeur. The internal doorways of Fountains Abbey, where the ruin is extensive enough to preserve many door openings in their original positions, stand at around 5 feet 8 to 6 feet. The chapter house entrance, a somewhat grander opening, given its importance in monastic life, is a little taller. The doorways into the individual monks' cells in the reredota, the long dormitory building where the community slept, are typically toward the lower end of this range. The Cistercian monks were, in theory at least, men drawn from all classes of society. In practice, the early Cistercians in England drew heavily from the minor nobility and the prosperous free peasantry, groups that were better nourished on average than the landless poor. Their skeletons suggest average heights toward the upper end of the medieval range, perhaps 5 feet, 6 to 5 feet 8 for men. The doors of fountains fit these bodies with a margin of comfort rather than luxury. Sleep, when it comes in a cold and dark and ancient place, has a particular quality. Imagine sleeping in a longhouse on Dartmoor in the 14th century. The wind comes off the moor in November with a cutting force, and the house is built low to the ground, with thick stone walls and a thatched roof that presses down against the weather. The doorway is low, and you have latched it against the night. Inside, the air smells of peat smoke and animals and the particular damp warmth of closely confined human life. You are not tall. You are perhaps 5 feet 5, which makes you an average man of your time. The space around you was made for you. The ceiling above the sleeping platform clears your head when you sit up. The door you will unlatch in the morning, when the grey Dartmoor dawn comes in, will not require you to bend. There is a strange intimacy in a space made to your exact dimensions. Modern buildings are generous almost to the point of indifference, offering clearances and margins that assume you might be a foot taller than you are. Medieval buildings were fitted to their inhabitants like a well-made garment, not tight, but precise. The 13th century brought another wave of building in Britain, driven by the wealth generated by wool and grain and the expanding trade networks of the later medieval economy. Parish churches were rebuilt and enlarged across the country. Market towns acquired guild halls and merchants' houses. The great wool churches of the Cotswolds went up, funded by the profits of the English sheep. The wool churches are interesting from the perspective of doorways because they represent, in many cases, the investments of wealthy merchants who wanted to make a visible statement about their prosperity and piety. The south porch of a wool church like Northleach in Gloucestershire or Chipping Campden in the same county is a grand affair, tall and elaborately carved, proclaiming the donor's generosity and the community's ambition. But walk through the porch into the body of the church and you encounter the everyday architecture of medieval worship, the nave walls and their clerestory windows, the chancel arch, the doorways that separate the different areas of the building from each other. These internal openings are not ceremonial, they are functional, and they are sized for medieval bodies. The chancel arch of a typical medieval parish church stands at around 10 to 12 feet, which is impressive but not excessive. The doorway from the nave into the tower, if there is one, is typically around 6 feet. The door into the vestry is often lower. These are spaces that were actually moved through by the people of the medieval parish, and they are spaces that fit those people with a precision that is now just slightly wrong for the bodies we bring to them. There is a church in the village of Greenstead in Essex that is, by most measurements, the oldest wooden building still standing in the world. The nave walls of Greenstead Church are built from the split trunks of oak trees, set vertically, and dendrochronological analysis has dated some of these timbers to the 9th century CE, the Anglo-Saxon period. The doorways of Greenstead Church have been modified over the centuries, as the building has been restored and altered and adapted to new uses. The current doorway is not original in its dimensions, but the general scale of the building, the height of the walls and the width of the nave gives a sense of the space in which Saxon worshippers gathered. Greenstead is a small building. The nave is perhaps 15 feet wide and 40 feet long, a compact rectangular space that would have held, at capacity, perhaps 100 people standing close together. The original doorway, based on the proportions of comparable Saxon buildings, would have been around 5 feet, 6 to 5 feet 8 tall. The windows are tiny, more like arrow slits than windows, designed to admit some light without losing much heat. To stand inside Greenstead is to stand inside a space that was built for bodies that were not yours. The proportions are not dramatic, not extreme, not obviously wrong. They are just slightly off, slightly scaled down, in a way that you feel rather than see. The history of doorways is also, in part, the history of building technology. You cannot make a wider or taller doorway than your structural system will support, and for much of British history, the structural systems available were limited. Stone arches solved the structural problem of the doorway with elegant simplicity. A semicircular arch, of the kind the Romans brought to Britain and the Normans later refined into the characteristic rounded arch of Romanesque architecture, distributes the weight above an opening in a way that allows openings of almost any width. The key limit is the skill of the mason and the quality of the stone, but even with a structural system that could, in principle, support very large openings, buildings tended to keep their everyday doors modest. Large openings are expensive to construct and difficult to secure. Every extra foot of height in a doorway is another foot of door to hang, another foot of gap to fill with draft-excluding materials, another foot of potential weakness in the wall. Practical economics, as much as bodily dimensions, kept doors to a reasonable size, and reasonable, for most of British history, meant something that cleared a body of average contemporary dimensions with a comfortable margin. It is only when we bring our modern bodies to these doors that the margin disappears. The Black Death, which reached England in 1348 and killed between a third and a half of the population in its first wave, had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate catastrophe. One of its demographic effects was to change the nutritional landscape of the survivors. Fewer people meant more land per person. More land meant more food per person. The labor shortage created by mass death drove up wages for the surviving workers, giving them more purchasing power. More purchasing power meant better diets. Skeletal evidence from the post-plague period shows a modest but measurable increase in average heights among the English population. The better-fed survivors of the Black Death and their children and grandchildren grew taller than their predecessors. But taller is relative. The post-plague population of England was still not tall by modern standards. The increase might have amounted to an inch or so, taking average male height from around 5 feet 4 to perhaps 5 feet 5 or 5 feet 6. The buildings of the later medieval period reflect this slight increase with doors that are marginally more generous than their 13th century predecessors. The great building boom of the late 14th and 15th centuries, when wool wealth and plague-era labor dynamics combined to fund an extraordinary flourishing of church buildings and domestic architecture, produced doorways that are, on average, just slightly taller than those of the earlier period. Not dramatically so, just enough to notice if you are looking carefully. The Tudor period, which began in 1485, with Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field, is associated in popular imagination with a particular aesthetic. The elaborate, decorative brickwork of Hampton Court Palace, the carved timber facades of merchant houses, the grand display of a newly self-confident national culture. Tudor doorways reflect this aesthetic. They became more elaborate, more decorated, more concerned with making a statement about the occupant's status and sophistication. The four-centered arch, that is the hallmark of the perpendicular Gothic style that dominated English architecture through the 15th and early 16th centuries, allowed for flatter, wider openings that could be decorated with complex tracery and carved ornament. But did Tudor doorways get taller? Did the people of Tudor England stand taller than their medieval predecessors? And did their buildings respond? The evidence is mixed. Some researchers see a continued modest increase in average heights through the 16th century, as agricultural productivity improved and trade brought a wider range of foods to more of the population. Others see stagnation or slight decline in some periods, as population growth after the plague-era trough began to press against food resources again. What the buildings show is variation. High-status Tudor buildings, the great houses of the nobility and the prosperous gentry, have doorways that are generous by medieval standards, often 6 feet or more in the everyday passages and up to 7 or 8 feet in the principal rooms. Lower-status buildings remain more modest. The gap between the doorways of the wealthy and the doorways of the poor is, if anything, wider in the Tudor period than it was in the medieval. The rich were eating better, growing taller, building larger. The poor were doing none of these things. Henry VIII, that most physically imposing of English monarchs, is a useful case study in the relationship between individual stature and historical imagination. The popular image of Henry VIII is of an enormously fat man, the product of Holbein's famous portrait of 1540, when the king was in his late 40s and had been suffering from a jousting injury and other ailments for years. But the younger Henry, the Henry of his accession, at 18 in 1509, was by contemporary accounts an exceptionally tall and athletic man. The evidence of his surviving armour at the Tower of London tells us that the young Henry was around 6 feet at 2 inches tall. This is extraordinary by the standards of his time. It is tall by the standards of our time. It made him a genuine physical phenomenon among his contemporaries, and he was clearly aware of this and cultivated an image of physical magnificence throughout his reign. Henry's height helps explain some things about the spaces he moved through. The Great Hall at Hampton Court, which he remodelled and enlarged, is a magnificent space with a ceiling high enough to accommodate even his imposing frame. The doors into the royal apartments are among the grandest in the palace. But Henry was an outlier. He was to his contemporaries what a 7-foot-tall person is to us today. Genuinely remarkable, outside the range of normal. The doors of his palaces were built for his body, yes, but they were not representative of how doors were built for ordinary people of his time. Most 16th century Englishmen, the farmers and craftsmen and merchants who made up the bulk of the population, were a foot or more shorter than their king. They moved through doors that fit them, not doors that would have fit Henry. The 17th century brought both the English Civil War and, eventually, the Restoration and a new era of cultural confidence. It also brought, in its final decades, the beginnings of what would become the agricultural revolution, the transformation of English farming that would, over the following century, change the nutritional landscape of the country. The new farming methods, the enclosures, the crop rotations, the improved livestock breeds, all of these changes eventually produced more food per acre and more protein per farm. But the effects took time to filter through to the bodies of the population at large, and the 17th century itself was a period of considerable nutritional stress for much of the English working class. The doorways of 17th century vernacular buildings, the yeoman farmhouses and urban terraces that survive in considerable numbers, tend to be around 5 feet 8 to 6 feet for everyday passages. This is broadly similar to the late Tudor period and suggests that average heights had not changed dramatically. What had changed was the style of door making. The heavy oak planks of the medieval period gave way to more sophisticated joinery. The panelled door with its mortise and tenon joints and its carefully fitted frame. The door became more of a piece of furniture and less of a piece of building, and this refinement brought with it a new attention to the proportions of the opening. The elegant proportions of a good 17th century doorway, with its pilasters and pediment and carefully calculated relationship between width and height, reflect an architectural culture that was thinking carefully about the aesthetics of entry. But the dimensions were still based on the bodies of the people who would use them, bodies that were still, by our standards, fairly modest in scale. The 18th century is, in the history of British architecture, the century of Georgian elegance. The Georgian style, derived from classical Italian architecture, through the work of architects like Inigo Jones and later Colin Campbell and the other protagonists of the Palladian movement, placed enormous emphasis on proportion and harmony. Georgian doorways are among the most beautiful in British architecture. The fanlight above the door, the slender pilasters flanking the frame, the carefully calibrated relationship between the height of the door and the height of the room beyond. These are the products of a culture that had thought deeply about the aesthetics of the threshold. But what were the dimensions? The standard Georgian door in a London townhouse stands at around 6 feet 6 inches to 7 feet. This is noticeably more generous than the typical medieval or Tudor door. It reflects partly the architectural fashion of the period, which favoured tall windows and tall rooms and tall doors in the interest of elegant proportion. But it also reflects a population that was, if not dramatically taller than its predecessors, at least aspirationally taller, at least aware that a generous door was a mark of status and refinement. The rooms behind these doors, in the great Georgian terraces of Bath and Edinburgh and the Bloomsbury squares of London, are proportioned for people who were, perhaps, 5 feet 8 or 5 feet 9 as the average for the prosperous middle and upper classes for whom these buildings were designed. The servants' quarters and the basement areas of the same buildings tell a different story. The doors to the service areas of Georgian townhouses are typically much lower and narrower, barely 6 feet in many cases, reflecting the bodies and the status of the people who used them. The Industrial Revolution transformed Britain's relationship with its own body. The factories and mills of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought a new kind of physical demand on the human form. Factory work required a different kind of body from agricultural work, more repetitive, more sedentary in some respects, more intensive in others. The long hours, the poor ventilation, the childhood labor that stunted growth, all of these conditions produced a population that was, in the crucial decades of industrial expansion, actually getting shorter in some segments. The records of the Marine Society, which measured men seeking employment as sailors in the late 18th century, show a clear trend of declining average heights among the applicants. The records of the military show similar patterns. The working classes of industrial Britain were, on average, shorter in 1820 than their great-grandparents had been in 1720. The buildings of industrial Britain reflect this. The working-class terraces of Manchester and Bradford and Leeds have doorways that are not generous. Typically, around 5 feet 8 to 6 feet, they were adequate for bodies that were, statistically, at the lower end of even the historical range. The factory buildings themselves are instructive. The early textile mills, built before the machinery dictated the building's proportions, have internal passageways and doorways scaled for workers who were, on average, quite short. As machinery grew larger and more elaborate, the buildings grew to accommodate it, but the human-scale doorways remained modest. Let us pause for a moment and think about the act of ducking through a low door. It is, in the first instance, a mildly uncomfortable physical act. You bend your neck, lower your head, perhaps stoop your shoulders slightly. Your body performs a small act of submission to the built environment, a momentary acknowledgement that the space you are entering was not made with your dimensions in mind. But there is also something else in this act. When you duck through a very old door, you are entering a space that was built for a specific body that is not your body. And in that moment, you are, in a small but genuine way, coming into contact with the pastness of the past. The door is not abstract history. It is physical evidence. It is a measure. It is the specific height that someone, at some specific moment in the past, decided was high enough. There is something humbling about this, and something strangely moving. The human body is not an abstract constant across time. It changes. It responds to its conditions. It shrinks under stress and grows under abundance. And the doors we build are the precise record of what our bodies were at the moment we built them. The Victorians, who inherited a tradition of low and modest everyday doorways, began to change things in the second half of the 19th century. As urban sanitation improved, as the great sewers of London and the other major cities were built, as the waterborne diseases that had devastated working-class communities began to recede, as the fruits of industrial production began to raise living standards for at least some of the working class, the average body began to grow. The Public Health Act of 1875, which required local authorities to provide clean water and adequate sewage disposal, is often cited as a turning point. So is the introduction of compulsory elementary education in 1870, which brought at least some regular provision of food to children whose diets were otherwise inadequate. The School Meals Act of 1906 formalized this, providing hot meals to the most undernourished children in state schools. These were, from the perspective of the built environment, revolutionary changes. A generation that grew up with school meals was a generation that grew up taller than the generation before it, and taller people, eventually, build taller doors. The Victorian terrace, built in the second half of the 19th century for the aspirant working class and the lower middle class, has doors that are typically around 6 feet to 6 feet, 2 inches. This is already noticeably more generous than the Georgian working-class housing of 60 or 70 years earlier. By the end of the Victorian era, the standard domestic doorway was inching upward. The Edwardian period, roughly 1900 to 1914, is often regarded as a golden age of British domestic architecture. The arts and crafts movement, the Garden City idealism, the influence of architects like Edwin Lutyens and Charles Voysey all combined to produce a house-building tradition of considerable quality and thoughtfulness. The Edwardian house has doorways that are, typically, around 6 feet, 2 to 6 feet, 4 inches. This is a meaningful increase from the Victorian standard, and it reflects a population that was growing measurably taller. The interwar period continued this trend, with the municipal housing of the 1920s and 1930s offering doorways of around 6 feet 4. The post-war housing boom, the great construction of council estates and new towns that followed the Second World War, standardized the British doorway at something close to its modern dimensions. The Parker-Morris standards that governed council house design from 1961 specified minimum room sizes, minimum window areas, and, implicitly, minimum doorway dimensions that were based on the actual bodies of mid-20th century British people. These were, by historical standards, remarkable bodies, well-fed, tall, healthy, bodies that had grown up with school meals and the National Health Service and cheap protein and the welfare state. Bodies that were a foot taller, on average, than the bodies that had built the Saxon church at Escombe or the medieval longhouses of Dartmoor. Britain is now a country that contains, in its built environment, a remarkable range of historical body dimensions. You can walk, in a single afternoon, through doorways that span 1,000 years of human physical history. The door of Escombe Church, barely 5.5 feet tall, is a direct physical record of the bodies of 7th century Northumbrians. The Norman doorway of a country church, a little more generous at perhaps 5 feet 10, records the bodies of the 12th century. The Georgian fanlight door of a Bath terrace, at 6 feet 6, records the aspirations and the bodies of the 18th century's prosperous classes. And the modern front door of a new-build house, at 6 feet 7 or more, records the bodies we have become, taller, better nourished, more generously proportioned than any of our predecessors in this island's long history. This is a kind of deep time that you can feel with your body. You do not need to read about it. You just need to walk through enough old doors. There is one more dimension to this story that we have not yet fully explored, and it concerns not just height, but width. Medieval doorways are, almost without exception, narrower than modern ones. The standard modern British doorway is about 32 inches wide. A typical medieval doorway might be 24 to 28 inches. A Saxon doorway might be 20 inches or less. Width is partly a structural issue. Wider doorways require more complex and expensive structural solutions. A narrow doorway is easier to build and easier to defend. But width also reflects the dimensions of the bodies passing through. Medieval people were not just shorter than us. They were, in general, narrower. The evidence of their armor and their clothing suggests shoulder widths that would today be considered quite slight. The suits of armor preserved in the Tower of London and at various country houses consistently surprise modern visitors with their narrowness. These were not people who would have blocked a doorway with their shoulders. The narrow medieval doorway was not, therefore, as much of a squeeze as it would be for a modern adult. It was scaled in width as well as height for the bodies it was meant to admit. The relationship between architecture and the body is one of the fundamental questions of design. Every building makes assumptions about the body that will inhabit it, assumptions about height and width and reach and angle of vision and the mechanics of movement. When those assumptions are correct, when the building fits the body, the experience of the space is comfortable and unremarkable. We notice buildings when they don't fit. We bang our heads on low beams. We squeeze sideways through narrow passages. We find ourselves on tiptoe reaching for a handle that is too high or bending awkwardly to use a counter that is too low. Very old buildings in Britain create this kind of friction constantly for modern visitors, not because they were badly designed, but because they were designed for different bodies. The friction is not a failure. It is a kind of historical communication. It is the building telling you, in the only language it has, that you are not the person it was made for. Historians and archaeologists talk about the concept of the mean or average historical person, the statistical individual who represents the typical body of a given era. This is always a construct, always an abstraction from the messy reality of actual human variation. People have always been tall and short, wide and narrow, within the range of their particular time and place. But the construct is useful. The mean medieval person was shorter and narrower than the mean modern person. The mean Saxon person was shorter still. The mean Iron Age person was probably comparable to the mean medieval person, though with considerable variation depending on region and class. And the buildings that these mean people made are the record of their mean dimensions, their typical reach, their average headroom, the typical width of their frame as they move through the spaces they created. When we enter those spaces, we are measuring ourselves against that mean. We are discovering, with our bodies, what the average was then and how far we have moved from it. There is a particular pleasure in this kind of physical archaeology, a pleasure that comes from encountering history, not as text or image, but as space. We read about the past, we look at pictures of the past, but we also, if we are lucky, inhabit the past, move through its spaces, feel its proportions against our bodies. The pleasure of the old building is partly aesthetic, the beauty of ancient craftsmanship and the patina of age. But it is also partly kinesthetic, the physical experience of a space that was made for a body different from yours. You become, in these moments, a kind of living measuring instrument. The gap between you and the doorway is the gap between your time and that time. You feel it in your neck as you bow to pass through, in your shoulders as they brush the jambs, in the slight disorientation of a ceiling that is just a little lower than your sense of normal. These are small sensations, but they are real ones, and they carry, for those who attend to them, a genuine intimacy with the past. The oldest surviving door in Britain is probably not the one you might expect. It is not in a great cathedral or a royal palace. It is in Westminster Abbey, in the chapter house, and it dates to around 1050 CE. It is a modest door made of 5 oak planks held together with iron reinforcing strips, and it is remarkable primarily for its survival over 1,000 years. It has been rehung and restored and maintained, but the timber is original, the oldest substantial piece of domestic woodwork in the country. The door stands at around 5 feet 10 inches. It is narrow, barely 22 inches wide. It is the kind of door that a modern adult can pass through without extreme difficulty, but also without comfort. You feel the narrowness in your shoulders, the height in your instinct to duck even when ducking is barely necessary. This door was made in the mid-11th century, on the eve of the Norman conquest. The person who made it was thinking about the bodies of the canons of Westminster Abbey, men of some status and probably of somewhat better nutrition than the average, and he built them a door that fit those bodies. 1,000 years later, we pass through it with our different bodies and feel the fit shift, feel the margins narrow, feel the past pressing gently against us. As we come to the end of this journey through Britain's oldest doorways, it is worth pausing to reflect on what we have learned about the relationship between bodies, buildings, and time. We have learned that the average British body has grown, in the course of the last 1,000 years, by something between 3 and 5 inches in height. We have learned that this growth has not been steady or linear, but has fluctuated with the availability of food, the prevalence of disease, and the social and economic conditions of different eras. We have learned that doorways record these fluctuations with a directness and precision that no written source can quite match. They are the built evidence of bodies, the architectural dimension of biological history. We have learned that the experience of moving through very old buildings is a physical encounter with this history, a kinesthetic lesson in the reality of change over time. When you duck through a Saxon doorway or squeeze through a medieval gate, you are not just visiting the past, you are measuring yourself against it. And we have learned that Britain's built environment contains, preserved in stone and wood and brick, a remarkable range of these measurements, a complete archive of the bodies that have inhabited this island across 2,000 years and more. The next time you visit an old building, perhaps a country church or a medieval castle or a Tudor farmhouse, pay attention to the doorways. Notice their height, notice their width, notice whether you need to duck or whether your shoulders brush the jambs, or whether the passage feels oddly intimate, oddly fitted to a body that is not quite yours. These are not random dimensions. They are not accidents of construction or failures of craftsmanship. They are the precise record of other people's bodies, people who lived in this place centuries before you, people who built their doors to fit themselves and could not have imagined the taller, broader bodies that would one day come to visit. The doorway is an archive. Walk through it slowly. Let it measure you against all those who came before. There is a final thought to rest with as we close. Britain is a small island with a very long history, and that history is written not just in its documents and its artworks and its literature, but in its stones and its timbers, in the physical fabric of the places it has made. The doorways are part of this writing, a particularly intimate part, because they record not events or ideas but bodies. They record the physical fact of human life in this place across deep time. We are taller than our ancestors. We are better fed, better nourished, longer lived in general than any previous generation of this island's people. We carry in our bodies the accumulated benefits of centuries of gradual improvement in living standards, the slow, hard-won gains of public health and nutrition and medicine. And we carry these bodies into the spaces our ancestors built for theirs, and the fit is never quite right. The doors are a little low, the passages are a little narrow, the ceilings pressed down a little closer than we expect. This slight wrongness is not a problem. It is a gift. It is the past pressing against the present, measuring the distance between then and now with the most direct and physical instrument available. It is telling us, we were here. We were smaller than you. We built our world to fit us. And now you walk through our world and feel, in your bones and your neck and your shoulders, exactly how much you have changed. Sleep now and dream of the doorways we have left behind. Dream of the hands that cut the stone and hung the oak and set the lintels in their courses. Dream of the bodies that passed through those doors 10 centuries ago. Bodies that were real and warm and alive. Bodies that were perhaps 5 feet 4 or 5 feet 5. Bodies that moved through their world with the ease of fit, with the comfort of proportion, with the quiet confidence of people in a space made exactly for them. And know that those spaces are still here. They are waiting for you in the old churches and the ruined abbeys and the preserved farmhouses of this ancient island. They are waiting to tell you, in the only language they have, the story of the bodies that made them. It is a quiet story. It is a patient story. It is written in stone and oak and the careful measure of a lintel set at the perfect height for hands that have been dust for 1,000 years. Rest now. The doors are still standing. Part 2. The archaeology of scale. When archaeologists excavate a medieval town, they do not always find the walls standing. In most cases, the walls are gone, robbed out for building stone in subsequent centuries, or collapsed under the weight of time, or simply never built to last. What they find instead are foundations, the lowest courses of masonry that were set below ground level and therefore escaped the worst of the demolition. From foundations, the archaeologist can reconstruct the plan of the building. They can tell you how many rooms it had, how it was oriented, how it related to its neighbors. What they often cannot tell you, from foundations alone, is how tall the building was. But doorways leave evidence. Even a doorway that has been reduced to its foundations tells you something. The width of the opening in the foundation course, the position of the threshold stone if it survives, the fragments of decorative moulding that sometimes accumulate in the destruction layers around the base of a demolished wall. These things allow researchers to estimate the dimensions of the door that stood above them. And what those estimates consistently show, across hundreds of excavated medieval sites in Britain, is that the everyday doorway of the medieval town was a modest thing, scaled for bodies that were smaller than ours. The medieval town is a particularly rich context for thinking about doorways and bodies, because the medieval town was a place of extraordinary density and variety. In a city like York or Bristol or Winchester in the 12th or 13th century, you might find within a single street the workshops of craftsmen, the stalls of merchants, the dwellings of apprentices, the houses of prosperous burghers, the halls of guilds, and the churches of half a dozen parishes. All of these different functions required different kinds of spaces, and the spaces had different kinds of doors. The doorway of a craftsman's workshop, through which raw materials had to be carried in and finished goods carried out, needed to be wide enough to admit whatever the craftsman was making. A carpenter's workshop might need to admit lengths of timber. A weaver's workroom needed to admit bales of wool. These practical requirements pushed workshop doorways wider than they might otherwise be, without necessarily making them taller. The doorway of a merchant's house, through which the merchant wanted to project an image of prosperity and sophistication, was likely to be more decoratively treated than that of a craftsman's shop, with carved stonework or painted woodwork, but not necessarily much taller. The medieval standard of what counted as an impressive doorway was calibrated to the medieval standard of what counted as a tall person. The doorway of a guild hall, through which the members of the guild processed in their liveries on ceremonial occasions, might be a little more generous, designed to admit a group of people moving together without their having to shuffle awkwardly through a narrow opening. But even the guild hall doors of medieval British cities were not dramatically tall by modern standards. The guilds of medieval Britain are a fascinating social institution, and their halls are among the most interesting domestic buildings of the period to survive. York has several remarkable examples. The Merchant Adventurers' Hall, which dates from the mid-14th century, is perhaps the finest surviving medieval guild hall in England. The Merchant Adventurers' Hall is a long, low building with a magnificent timber roof, and it has survived in part because it has been continuously used since its construction. The main hall, the great hall where the merchants gathered to transact their business, has a ceiling that rises to around 20 feet at the crown of the roof. This is generous by medieval domestic standards, a space designed to impress as well as to function. But the doorways that give access to this hall are not so generous. The main entrance, facing the street, is around 6 feet tall. The internal doorways between the hall and the chapel and the undercroft are comparable. These are functional doors, wide enough to admit a group of merchants without crowding, but not designed to make any particular statement about the height of the people using them. The merchant adventurers themselves, the wealthy traders who financed and built this hall, were probably among the taller and better nourished people of 14th century York. They ate well and lived in comfortable houses and had the resources to give their children adequate food through childhood. Their skeletons, if we had them, would probably show heights toward the upper end of the medieval range, perhaps 5 feet, 7 or 5 feet 8 for the more prosperous individuals. Their hall was built for those bodies. The modern visitor who stoops slightly at the doorway is discovering, with their spine, the distance between their body and the body the building was designed for. Let us think for a moment about the experience of childhood in a very old building. Children are always shorter than the buildings they inhabit, and children's buildings, the spaces specifically designed for children, are scaled accordingly. But children grow, and they grow toward adult proportions, and the buildings they inhabit as children are therefore always slightly ahead of them, always offering a glimpse of the dimensions they will eventually reach. In a medieval building, a child of 10 would have found the doorways entirely comfortable, built to adult dimensions that they were approaching but had not yet reached. A teenager of 15 would have found them correct, fitting their emerging adult body with the precision of design. A man of 25 would have found them just right, the product of a system calibrated to exactly his dimensions. Only in old age, if arthritis or injury bent the spine and reduced the effective height, would the medieval person find the medieval doorway too small. And by then, presumably, they would have stopped caring very much about the height of doors. Now think about the same experience in a medieval building inhabited by a modern family. A child of 10 would find the doorways comfortable. A teenager of 15 would begin to find them tight. A man of 25 would find them requiring careful navigation. A man of 30, who is 6 feet, 1 inch tall, would find them genuinely inconvenient. The building was built for a family that topped out at 5 feet 8. It is now inhabited by a family that tops out at 6 feet 1. The building has not changed. The family has. There is a concept in human geography called the affordance landscape, the pattern of possibilities and constraints that a physical environment offers to the bodies moving through it. A steep hill affords climbing but constrains wheeled transport. A river affords fishing and bathing but constrains direct passage. A building affords shelter and enclosure but shapes the movement and posture of the people inside it. The doorway is one of the most fundamental elements of any building's affordance landscape. It defines what can come in and what can go out, what is admitted and what is excluded. And in a building scaled for a body different from your own, the affordance landscape is subtly wrong, subtly misaligned with your actual physical capabilities and constraints. You can get through the medieval door as a modern adult, but you cannot get through it the way a medieval adult got through it, with ease and without thought. You must attend to it. You must manage your body in relation to it. You must perform a small calculation every time you approach it, adjusting your trajectory and your posture to accommodate a frame that was not built for you. This constant small management of the body in relation to the built environment is one of the ways that historically misaligned spaces communicate their pastness. They require something from you that your own contemporary spaces do not require. They ask you to attend to your body in a way that modern design, which assumes your modern dimensions, never asks. The monastery is a particularly interesting institution for thinking about bodies and spaces, because the monastery had a very specific idea about the proper relationship between the body and the built environment. Monastic architecture was not simply functional, it was symbolic, and its symbolism expressed a theology of the body and its place in the world. The cloister, the enclosed garden at the heart of the monastery, was a representation of paradise, the garden of the original creation. The chapter house, where the community gathered to hear a chapter of the rule, read aloud and to conduct its administrative business, was a space of authority and discipline. The dormitory, where the monks slept in rows on their pallets, was a space of humility and shared vulnerability. Each of these spaces had its appropriate dimensions and its appropriate doorways. The cloister walk was open to the garden on one side and closed on the other, a covered passage through which the monks moved in an ordered circuit. The doorways leading off the cloister into the various buildings of the monastery were sized with a careful attention to the status and function of the space they gave access to. The most prestigious spaces, the church and the chapter house, had the most elaborate doorways. The humbler spaces, the refectory and the dormitory, had simpler and more modest openings. The working spaces, the kitchen and the bakehouse and the brewhouse, had the most functional doorways of all. sized for practicality rather than ceremony. All of these doorways were sized for the bodies of the monks who used them, and those bodies were at the great Benedictine and Cistercian monasteries of medieval England, not the bodies of the poorest and most malnourished members of society. Monks ate regular meals and were not subject to the seasonal food shortages that afflicted the rural poor. The skeletal evidence from monastic cemeteries suggests that monks were, on average, slightly better nourished and slightly taller than the general population. The doorways of the great monasteries reflect this, being, on average, a little more generous than those of the humblest parish churches and longhouses. But they are still medieval doorways, still sized for medieval bodies, and they still require modern visitors to manage their body in relation to the opening in a way that the original monks never had to. The dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 1530s and 1540s was one of the most dramatic events in British architectural history. In the space of less than a decade, hundreds of religious houses were dissolved, their communities dispersed, their revenues seized by the crown, and their buildings put to new uses, or simply abandoned. Many of the great monastic buildings became quarries, their stone systematically dismantled and reused in new buildings. The carved doorways and window frames were particularly valued, being ready-made decorative elements that could be transplanted into new contexts. All across England, pieces of medieval monastic architecture ended up incorporated into farmhouses and manor houses, built in the decades after the dissolution, creating strange and sometimes poignant juxtapositions of old sacred stonework in new secular settings. A carved Norman doorway in a Gloucestershire farmhouse, a Gothic window frame in a Yorkshire barn, a medieval floor tile in a Tudor kitchen. These fragments of monastic architecture are scattered through the English countryside, and they carry with them, like everything else from those buildings, an echo of the bodies they were made for. The English Reformation, of which the dissolution of the monasteries was a part, also changed the character of church buildings in Britain in ways that affected their doorways. The medieval church was a space of elaborate ceremony, of processions and rituals, and the movement of clergy and laity in carefully choreographed patterns. The positioning of doorways, screens, and passages within the medieval church was related to this ceremonial function, to the practical requirements of liturgy. The Reformation changed the liturgy and therefore changed the practical requirements of the church space. The Mass was abolished and replaced with a simpler communion service. The elaborate processions and the daily cycle of monastic hours ceased. The rood screen that divided the nave from the chancel was removed in many churches. The church became, in Protestant theology, primarily a place of preaching and of shared scripture, rather than of priestly ceremony. These changes did not immediately change the dimensions of doorways, but they did change the way people moved through the church building, and over time, they influenced the way new churches were built. The Protestant tradition valued visibility and audibility above all, the ability of the congregation to see and hear the minister. This tended toward wider, more open spaces, rather than the narrow chancels and side chapels of the medieval church. New churches built in the century after the Reformation tend to have doorways that are slightly more generous than their medieval predecessors, partly because the social and economic changes of the period were producing a slightly taller population, and partly because the new Protestant aesthetic favored a certain openness and accessibility that the secretive layering of the medieval church had not encouraged. Let us turn now to a building type that we have not yet considered, the castle. The English castle is, in its origins, a military installation, a defensible residence for the Norman aristocracy that conquered Britain after 1066. The earliest castles were simple affairs, earthen mounds topped with wooden towers, surrounded by stockades. Within 2 generations, these had been replaced in most cases by stone buildings. The great stone keeps that still stand in places like the Tower of London, Rochester Castle, and Castle Hedingham in Essex. The stone keep of a Norman castle is one of the most impressive structures in the British landscape, even in its ruined state. It is a massive cube of stone, with walls 8 to 15 feet thick, rising to heights of 60, 80, or even 100 feet. It was designed to be impregnable, or as near to impregnable as the technology of the 11th and 12th centuries could manage. The doorways of the great keeps are not, in most cases, at ground level. They are typically raised to the level of the first floor, accessed by a timber stair or ladder that could be removed in times of attack. This is a security measure rather than a statement about the height of the occupants. The raised door made the keep much harder to batter down, but within the keep, the internal doorways are more revealing. The passages between floors, the doorways into the various chambers, the openings in the partition walls of the Great Hall. These are the everyday doorways of Norman aristocratic life, and they are scaled for the bodies of Norman aristocrats. The Normans who built and occupied these keeps were, as we have noted, a military elite who were probably better nourished than the average. They were also people with a strong tradition of martial culture, of physical training and exercise, that may have contributed to somewhat greater average heights than the civilian population. Skeletal evidence from high-status Norman burials suggests average male heights of around 5 feet, 7 to 5 feet 8, with some individuals considerably taller. The internal doorways of the Norman keeps reflect this. They tend to be a little more generous than those of the parish churches of the same period, around 6 feet or slightly more in many cases, but they are still not generous by modern standards. The modern tourist who visits the Tower of London and moves through the internal spaces of the White Keep finds them intimate in a way that goes beyond simple narrowness. The spaces are scaled for a body that is not quite theirs. The Castle. Hedingham Keep in Essex is one of the finest surviving Norman keeps in England, built around 1140 for the De Vere family, the Earls of Oxford. It stands 4 stories high, with walls 12 feet thick, and it contains one of the most magnificent Norman Great Halls to survive anywhere in Britain. The Great Hall of Castle Hedingham occupies the second floor of the keep and has a remarkable 2-story interior, with a gallery running around the upper level and a soaring arch across the full width of the hall. It is a space of genuine grandeur, designed to impress visitors with the power and magnificence of the De Vere family. The doorway into this hall, accessed from the exterior stair on the south face of the keep, stands at around 6 feet 2 inches. The internal doorways, the passages between the hall and the various service rooms and the garderobe are slightly lower, around 5 feet 10. The spiral staircase that connects the floors is, like all Norman spiral stairs, remarkably narrow and low, with a ceiling that presses down uncomfortably on anyone over 5 feet 10. This was not a building of discomfort for its original inhabitants. The De Vere moved through it with ease, because it was built for them. The modern visitor who comes to this magnificent space finds it just slightly wrong, just slightly misaligned with the body they have brought to it, and this slight wrongness is itself a kind of historical information. The English landscape is full of buildings that have been adapted and altered over the centuries, buildings in which different historical periods have left overlapping traces. A church might have a Saxon nave, a Norman chancel, a medieval tower, a Victorian restoration, and a modern toilet block. A manor house might have a Tudor core, Georgian additions, Victorian service wings, and 21st century double glazing. In these layered buildings, the doorways of different periods exist side by side, and you can read the history of changing body dimensions in the sequence of their heights. At Great Coxwell Barn in Oxfordshire, a building that dates mostly from the 13th century, the main barn doors are enormous, built to admit laden carts and livestock. But the human-scale doors, the smaller openings in the walls that gave access to the building, without requiring the massive main doors to be opened, are modest in their dimensions, around 5 feet 8 to 6 feet, reflecting the bodies of the 13th century agricultural workers who used them. At Haddon Hall in Derbyshire, a medieval and Tudor manor house that has been preserved in a remarkable state of completeness. You can trace the evolution of doorway dimensions from the medieval period through the Tudor and into the Jacobean. The oldest parts of the house have the lowest doors. The later additions are slightly more generous. The progression is not dramatic, but it is measurable, and it follows the gradual upward trend in average heights that the historical record suggests. One of the most interesting places to study the history of doorways in Britain is in the surviving examples of medieval domestic architecture in the country's historic towns. York is particularly rich in this regard. The city's medieval street pattern is largely intact, and a remarkable number of medieval buildings survive in various states of preservation and adaptation. The Shambles, the famous medieval street of butchers' shops, preserves a row of buildings from the 14th and 15th centuries in which the jutting upper stories have been continuously occupied ever since. The doorways of the Shambles buildings are instructive. The shops at street level have openings that are wider than they are tall, because the priority was admitting customers and displaying goods, rather than making a statement about height. The doorways from the shops into the back rooms and upstairs areas are more standardly proportioned, around 5 feet, 8 to 6 feet, reflecting the domestic scale of the medieval inhabitant. Walking down the Shambles today, you are walking through a space scaled for bodies that were, on average, shorter and narrower than yours. The buildings lean toward each other overhead, creating a shadowed canyon that feels intimate and enclosed. This feeling is not just about the narrowness of the street. It is about the scale of the buildings in relation to the body, a scale that was calibrated to different bodies from the ones walking here today. The physical sensation of being in a very old building is, in part, a sensation of slight wrongness. This is different from the wrongness of a badly designed modern building, which is a wrongness of intention, a failure to achieve what was intended. The wrongness of an old building is a wrongness of fit, a mismatch between its intentions and your body. The old building was well designed. It achieved exactly what it intended to achieve. It fitted the bodies it was built for with precision and comfort. The wrongness you feel in it is not its failure. It is yours, or rather, it is the body's innocent distance from the body it was designed for. This kind of wrongness is rarely uncomfortable in the way that a genuinely badly designed modern space is uncomfortable. It is more like the slight looseness of a garment that was made for someone else, or the slight stiffness of shoes that fit but were broken in by different feet. It is manageable, sometimes even pleasant, and it carries a quality of information that purely comfortable spaces never do. Sleep has been studied extensively as a biological phenomenon, but one of the things that has received less attention is the way the environment shapes the character of sleep. In a space built to your exact dimensions, sleep is unremarkable. The ceiling is at the expected distance. The walls are at the expected remove. The door, if there is one, sits at the expected height in the wall. You are surrounded by a kind of spatial comfort, a fit between body and environment that does not demand any conscious attention. In a space built for a smaller body, sleep is subtly different. You are aware of the space in a way that you might not be in a properly fitted room. The ceiling is closer, the walls feel nearer. The sense of enclosure is perhaps more pronounced. And this greater enclosure can have a paradoxical effect on sleep, making it feel more sheltered, more contained, more protected. This is perhaps part of the appeal of very small, very old sleeping spaces. The carved box beds of Welsh and Scottish farmhouses, the tiny dormitory cells of medieval monasteries, the low-ceilinged chambers of Tudor cottages. They enfold the body with a completeness that, Larger, more modern spaces do not. They are, in a spatial sense, a little like being held. The medieval monk on his pallet in the dormitory, the farmer in his box bed in the longhouse, the apprentice in his attic room in a merchant's house. These were people sleeping in spaces that fitted them. The fit was not just physical, it was psychological, the sense of being contained and protected that comes from being in a space scaled to your actual dimensions. The history of British sleeping arrangements is itself a history of changing body dimensions and changing ideas about the proper relationship between the body and its sleeping space. The medieval Great Hall, in which the lord and his household slept together on the rushes or on pallets arranged around the central hearth, was a space of collective warmth and mutual protection. The dimensions of the hall were calibrated to the number of bodies it needed to contain and warm, not to any single individual's stature. As the medieval period progressed and prosperity grew, the household began to fragment into more private sleeping arrangements. The lord acquired a private chamber, a sola, set above the great hall and accessible by a narrow stair. The sola was a more intimately scaled space, designed for 1 or 2 people, rather than 20 or 30, and its dimensions reflect this intimacy. The ceiling was lower, the room was smaller, the doorway was more modestly proportioned. The evolution of domestic privacy in British history is tracked, among other things, by the evolution of doorways. The great doorways of the Great Hall, through which the whole household moved together, gave way to the more modest doorways of private chambers, through which individuals moved alone or in small groups. And as the household fragmented into more private spaces, the doorways became more personal, more fitted to individual bodies and individual lives. The Victorian era, as we have noted, was a period of slow but steady increase in average British heights. But it was also a period of enormous enthusiasm for the past, for the medieval and the Tudor and the Georgian, for the architectural heritage of Britain as a source of national identity and pride. The Gothic revival of the 19th century, associated with architects like Augustus Pugin and George Gilbert Scott, produced a great wave of new buildings in medieval styles. Churches were built in Gothic, schools were built in Gothic, town halls were built in Gothic, and the doorways of these new Gothic buildings were built to the dimensions of their 19th century inhabitants, not to the dimensions of their medieval models. This creates an interesting anomaly in the history of British doorways. The medieval churches of the 13th century have doors of around 5 feet 10. The Victorian Gothic churches, built in imitation of those medieval churches, have doors of around 6 feet 2 or 6 feet 4. The difference is the difference in average height between the 13th century and the 19th. You can see this difference very clearly if you visit a town that has both a medieval parish church and a Victorian Gothic church built in similar style. The medieval church will require more care of a modern visitor, while the Victorian copy will feel perfectly comfortable. The copy is, paradoxically, more modern than the original because it was built for modern bodies. The Garden City movement of the early 20th century represents one of the most thoughtful attempts in British architectural history to think carefully about the relationship between bodies, buildings, and well-being. Letchworth, the first garden city, built from 1903 onward on the principles of Ebenezer Howard, was designed from the ground up to create an environment that would support healthy physical and mental life. The houses were built with gardens, the streets were tree-lined, the factories were separated from the residential areas, and the doorways of the houses were built to the dimensions of the bodies that were expected to inhabit them. Those bodies were, by the standards of 1903, not dramatically taller than their Victorian predecessors. The average height of a British adult man in 1900 was around 5 feet 7 or 5 feet 8. The houses of Letchworth were built for those bodies, with doorways around 6 feet, 2 to 6 feet 4. But Letchworth was also designed with an optimism about the future, a belief that the garden city environment would produce healthier, better nourished, and potentially taller people than the urban slums from which its early inhabitants came. In this, history proved the founders right. The second and third generations of Letchworth residents were measurably healthier than their parents, and somewhat taller. The doors they had inherited from the original houses were therefore slightly more comfortable for them than they had been for the first generation of inhabitants. The buildings were growing to fit their occupants, not through any physical change in the buildings themselves, but through the physical changes in the people living in them. As the 20th century advanced and average heights continued to rise, British building practice responded with steadily increasing standard dimensions. The interwar council houses of the 1930s were built with 6'4" doors as a standard. The post-war estates of the 1950s and 1960s moved to 6'6". The Parker-Morris standards that governed social housing from 1961 implied doors of this height as the minimum, and new buildings continued to grow. The commercial office buildings of the late 20th century, the shopping centres, the airports, the public institutions, all built to dimensions that assumed a population of 6 feet and over as unremarkable. The average British adult male of 2000 stood at 5 feet 10, but the buildings around him were sized for people rather taller than that. The 6-footers and the 6'2" who made up a substantial minority of the population. We have, in other words, overshot the historical trajectory. We have built for people taller than the average, and this means that the space between modern buildings and historical ones is, in terms of doorway height, even greater than the space between modern people and historical ones. A medieval church was built for people of 5 feet 5. We are 5 feet 10. The gap is 5 inches. A modern airport is built for people of 6 feet 2. We are 5 feet 10. We are smaller than the building's assumption, but not by much. But the gap between the medieval church and the modern airport is 12 inches. That is a foot of history, a foot of human growth, a foot of improved nutrition and medicine and public health, built into the doorways of the oldest buildings on this island. The study of historical heights through architectural evidence is a relatively new field, one that has grown up at the intersection of architectural history, osteoarchaeology, and human geography. Researchers in this field talk about the biological standard of living, the way that average height and body mass reflected the nutritional and health conditions of a population, as a complement to more traditional economic measures of well-being. The idea is straightforward. If you want to know whether people were really better off in one period than another, economic data can be misleading. Wages and prices and trade figures are affected by all sorts of factors that do not necessarily track how people's bodies were doing. But height is more direct. If people grew taller, they were in some fundamental biological sense better off. They were eating more and getting sick less. The architectural evidence for historical heights adds another dimension to this research. Literally, the doorways, the windowsills, the heights of counters and tables and storage niches, all of these elements carry information about the average body dimensions of the people who made and used them. They are, in effect, a built record of the biological standard of living at the time of their construction. And what that record shows, across the long sweep of British history, is a story of gradual improvement, punctuated by setbacks, of slow gains in nutrition and health interrupted by famine, plague, industrial disruption, and war. The story told by doorways matches, in broad outline, the story told by bones and records and economic histories. But it has a quality that those other sources lack. You can read it with your body. You can stand in a medieval church and feel, in the slight inadequacy of the doorway, the distance between your time and that time. You can walk through a Roman fort and find, in the proportions of its passages, the ghost of the body that built them. This is history you can touch, and history that touches you. It is, among other forms of historical encounter, one of the most immediate and the most honest. There is a final reflection to offer before we rest. Britain is a country that is unusually rich in very old buildings, not because it has been spared the usual forces of demolition and replacement, but because it has, for complex reasons, preserved more of its past than many comparable nations. The combination of early industrialization, which created wealth that could fund preservation, and a culture of historical sentiment, which valued old buildings as a form of national identity, has left Britain with a remarkable stock of ancient structures. These structures are not museums. They are, most of them, living buildings, in active use. Churches still hold services. Castles have been converted to hotels and offices and apartments. Medieval houses are inhabited by modern families. The old built environment of Britain is not preserved behind glass, but occupied and used, and the people who occupy and use it live in a daily encounter with the past that most other cultures do not experience. This daily encounter is, among other things, a daily encounter with different body dimensions. The family living in a medieval farmhouse in the Cotswolds adjusts its life to doorways made for bodies smaller than theirs. The congregation filing into a Norman church every Sunday passes through a doorway that reminds them, with every passage, that the building was not made for them. These encounters are small. They are not dramatic, but they accumulate over years and decades of living in old spaces into a kind of bodily knowledge of historical difference, a felt sense of the distance between our bodies and the bodies that built the places we inhabit. This knowledge is not easily written down. It lives in the body, in the slight stoop of the shoulders as you pass through an old door, in the automatic adjustment of the gaze to the lower ceiling. It is a knowledge that you carry in your posture and your movement, a physical memory of all the old spaces you have moved through. It is, in its quiet way, one of the most intimate forms of historical knowledge available to us, and it is available to anyone who walks slowly through an old building and pays attention to the doors. Rest now. The old buildings of Britain are still standing in the morning light and the evening rain. The Saxon churches with their narrow chancels, the Norman keeps with their spiral stairs, the medieval longhouses with their low lintels, the Tudor farmhouses with their modest parlour doors, the Georgian terraces with their fanlights. All of them are there, holding in their stone and timber, the precise measure of the bodies that built them. And the bodies that built them were real people, people who rose at dawn and went to bed at dark and worried about the harvest and the weather and the health of their children. People who walked through their own doors without thinking, because the doors were the right height, because the doors were made for them, because the world they moved through had been made by people of their size for people of their size, and everything fit. We visit their world now with bodies that are larger than the world was made for. We are guests in spaces built for smaller hosts. And in that slight displacement, that minor but persistent wrongness of fit, we touch something true about the past. We are larger than our ancestors. We are taller by inches, broader by a little. We carry in our bones the accumulated gift of centuries of gradual improvement, and we bring those bones into the spaces our ancestors built for theirs, and the spaces push back gently, with a pressure that is the pressure of time. The doors remember the bodies that pass through them. They hold, in the precise measurement of their openings, the height and the width of people who are gone. And when we bow our heads to enter, we are not just being careful. We are, in a way we may not fully understand, paying a small and bodily respect to the people who came before us. Sleep well. The old stones are patient. They have been waiting a long time. They will be here when you wake. Part 3. Stone by stone, door by door. There is a village in the Welsh borders, not far from the market town of Ludlow, where three different buildings stand within sight of each other, each representing a different century, each with a doorway that tells a different story. The oldest is a small Norman chapel, built in the 12th century from the local reddish sandstone. Its doorway is round-arched, the arch carved with a single ring of simple chevron ornament, and it stands at 5 feet 9 inches. The carved voussoirs of the arch are worn smooth by centuries of hands brushing against them as people pass through. The second building is a medieval barn, probably 14th century, with a great wagon door at one end and at the other a smaller human-scale door giving access to the threshing floor. The human-scale door is 5 feet 7 inches. The third building is a farmhouse, built in the early 19th century in the local vernacular style, stone walls and a slate roof, a sensible and modest house that has changed little in 200 years. Its front door stands at 6 feet 1 inch. Stand in front of all three buildings and the history of the British body is laid out before you in 3 data points. The Norman chapel at 5 feet 9, serving a population of 12th century Welsh Marches people who average perhaps 5 feet 4 or 5 feet 5. The medieval barn at 5 feet 7, slightly lower because it served agricultural workers who were, if anything, slightly shorter than the average due to harder lives and more uncertain nutrition. The 19th century farmhouse at 6 feet 1, serving a family that might have averaged 5 feet 7 or 5 feet 8. 3 buildings, 3 centuries roughly, 4 to 5 inches of human growth recorded in doorways. The Welsh Marches, the borderlands between England and Wales, are particularly rich in very old buildings because they were, for much of the medieval period, a military frontier. The Marcher lords built extensively to defend and administer their territories, and many of those buildings survive. The castles of Ludlow and Clun and Montgomery, the churches of Shropshire and Herefordshire, with their distinctive Romanesque doorways, the timber-framed houses of the prosperous towns, all of these preserve, in their dimensions, information about the bodies that built and used them. The Welsh-speaking population of the border areas was, through most of the medieval period, slightly shorter on average than the English-speaking population. This is not a matter of ethnicity, but of economics. The Welsh hill farmers of the Marches lived in poorer and more marginal conditions than the English farmers of the lowland valleys, and poorer conditions meant shorter bodies. The doorways of Welsh tradition longhouses in the upland areas of the Marches reflect this, being often slightly lower than comparable buildings in the more prosperous English lowlands of the same period. This is a fine-grained detail, visible only to the most attentive observer. But it is there, in the fabric of the buildings, for those who look for it. The English village church is, in many respects, the perfect archive of historical body dimensions. Most village churches have been in continuous use since their construction, which means they have not been demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Instead, they have been altered, added to, modified, restored, and each of these alterations has left traces. A church that was originally built in the 12th century may have had a new south aisle added in the 13th, a tower built in the 15th, a vestry added in the 18th, and a restoration undertaken in the 19th. Each of these phases of building added new doorways, and each new doorway reflects the body dimensions of its moment. If you know how to read them, you can walk around such a church and trace the history of human height in the sequence of its doorways. The original Norman north door will be around 5 feet 9 or 6 feet. The 13th century south aisle door will be perhaps 6 feet or a little over. The 15th century tower door will be 6 feet 1 or 2. The 18th century vestry door will be 6 feet 3 or 4. The Victorian restoration will have touched some doorways and left others alone. The accumulated sequence is a graph of changing human dimensions, written in stone and oak across 6 or 7 centuries. There is a particular quality to a very old church in the early morning, before the heating has come on and before any visitors have arrived. The cold is a specific kind of cold, the cold of stone that has been accumulating winter for 800 years, a cold that seeps rather than strikes. And the silence has a particular quality too, the silence of a space that has absorbed an enormous amount of sound over the centuries and somehow retained the ghost of it. In this cold and silence, the doorways have their full meaning. They are not just passages but presences, framings of the outside world that the church has been offering to generations of people since the Norman masons first set the lintel in its place. People have been passing through that doorway to pray and to mourn and to celebrate and to be married and to carry their children for baptism and to carry their parents for burial. The stone of the jambs has been touched by so many hands that it is worn smooth at the height where hands naturally reach as people pass through, polished by centuries of casual contact into a gleaming band at arm height. That polished band is at the arm height of the people who used the door, and their arm height was lower than ours because they were shorter than us, and the band of polished stone sits just slightly lower than your hand would naturally fall as you pass through. This is perhaps the most intimate record of all. Not the height of the lintel, but the height of a touching hand. The worn stone that marks exactly where generations of people reached as they moved through their world. The science of human growth is not simply a matter of nutrition, though nutrition is the dominant factor. Genetics plays a role, as does disease burden, as does the amount and type of physical work demanded of the body. During development, as does a range of environmental factors that researchers are still working to fully understand. One factor that has received increasing attention is the role of childhood illness in determining adult height. A child who suffers from repeated gastrointestinal infections during the first 2 years of life, when growth is most rapid, will grow less well than a child who is spared these infections, even if both children have equivalent access to food. This is because infection diverts the body's resources from growth to immune response. In the medieval and early modern period, before the germ theory of disease and the sanitary reforms that followed from it, gastrointestinal infection was endemic. The water supplies of medieval towns were routinely contaminated, food storage was poor, rates of intestinal parasites were extremely high. Children grew up in conditions of chronic low-level infection that persistently diverted resources from growth. The sanitary reforms of the 19th century changed this. Clean water and adequate sewage disposal reduced the burden of childhood infection. Healthier children grew taller, and the buildings of the 20th century, built for these taller people, are the architectural consequence of clean water and modern sewage. This is another way of reading British doorways as a history of public health. The gap between the Saxon door at 5 feet 6 and the modern door at 6 feet 7 is not just a history of better food. It is a history of clean water, of effective sewage disposal, of vaccination, of the National Health Service, of all the accumulated public health infrastructure that has allowed the British body to grow to its current dimensions. The relationship between height and status in medieval Britain was not always straightforward. We have noted that wealthier people tended to be taller because they ate better. But there were exceptions to this pattern, and the exceptions are instructive. The clergy, for example, were generally better nourished than the lay population at the same social level. Monasteries provided regular meals, and parish priests typically had access to tithe revenues that gave them a degree of food security. But the clergy were also often younger sons of prosperous families who had access to adequate nutrition in childhood. Both factors contributed to a clergy that was, on average, somewhat better nourished and somewhat taller than the general population of comparable social standing. The military, similarly, had access to more regular and more substantial food than many civilian occupations. The Roman military diet, as we have noted, was carefully managed. The medieval knight ate well, not just because of his social status, but because the physical demands of mounted warfare required substantial caloric intake. These occupational differences in diet produced occupational differences in stature, and these differences are reflected in the buildings associated with different occupations. The monastic buildings are slightly more generous in their doorways than the parish churches, serving the same economic community. The great castle halls are slightly more generous than the farmhouses of the same period. For me, in the city of Bath, the Roman city of Aquae Sulis, the relationship between ancient and modern is particularly vivid. The Roman baths that give the city its name are one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in Britain, a sequence of rooms and pools built around the natural hot spring that the Romans called the Sacred Spring. The baths were built in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE and were in use until the late Roman period. They were then abandoned and buried, lost under centuries of later building, until their rediscovery and excavation in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Roman rooms of the Great Bath and its surrounding suites are now open to the public, and visitors can walk through them at the level of the Roman floors. The door openings that survive or that have been reconstructed on the basis of the archaeological evidence stand at around 5 feet, 10 to 6 feet, consistent with what we would expect for a public buildings of the Roman period, serving a population with access to the relatively good Roman military and urban diet. Above the Roman remains, the 18th century city of Bath was built, one of the finest Georgian cities in Britain and one of the best preserved examples of Georgian urban architecture anywhere in the world. The doorways of Georgian Bath stand at around 6 feet 6 to 7 feet, the generous openings of a prosperous 18th century urban culture that was building for people who were taller than their Roman predecessors by perhaps an inch or two, but who were also building to an aesthetic that valued height and elegance for their own sake. Walk from the Roman baths to the Royal Crescent, and you move through 17 centuries of British body history in a single afternoon. The Roman door at 6 feet, the Georgian door at 6 feet 8. The gap is 8 inches of human growth, of improved nutrition, of everything that separated a Roman city dweller of 100 CE from a Georgian gentleman of 1775. The concept of liminal space, the space of thresholds and transitions, has become increasingly prominent in architectural theory in recent decades. Architects and theorists have paid increasing attention to the quality of the spaces between spaces, the corridors and doorways and stairwells that connect the rooms of a building without themselves being rooms. In very old buildings, these liminal spaces have a particular intensity. The threshold of a very old door is not just a transition between inside and outside. It is a transition between our time and another time, between our body and other bodies, between our world and a world that no longer exists except in the physical fabric of the building. When you step through the door of a 12th century church, you are not just moving from the churchyard to the nave. You are entering a space that was built by people who are gone, for people who are gone, in a style that expressed beliefs and values that have changed beyond recognition. The doorway is the moment of entry into that other world, the seam between then and now. And the height of that doorway is part of the quality of the entry. The slight bow of the head as you pass through, the momentary adjustment of posture that the low lintel requires, is part of the experience of crossing into the old space. It is not an inconvenience. It is a kind of initiation, a physical acknowledgement that you are entering a world that was made for bodies different from yours. Then, Britain's oldest doorways were built for people who were not our size. This is the simple fact from which we began, and it is the simple fact with which we end. But not our size is a phrase that contains, as we have seen, a great deal of history. The difference in size between a medieval British person and a modern one is not just a biological curiosity. It is the embodied record of centuries of nutritional change, of public health improvement, of rising living standards, of the accumulated social investment in the bodies of the population that has characterized the last 2 centuries of British history. When you duck through a low medieval door, you are, in a very real sense, touching this history. You are feeling, with your body, the distance between your time and that time. You are measuring yourself against the past and finding that you have grown. This growth is not guaranteed. The historical record shows that average heights can fall as well as rise, that populations can shrink under pressure as readily as they grow under abundance. The gains of the last 2 centuries are real but not inevitable. They depend on the public health infrastructure, the nutritional standards, the social provisions that have been built up over generations. The low door of the Saxon church is a reminder of what human bodies look like when those provisions are absent, when life is hard and food is scarce, and childhood illness is endemic, and people simply do not grow to the heights they might have reached under better conditions. The generous door of the modern building is a reminder of what becomes possible when those provisions are in place. Both doors are telling the truth. Let the old buildings hold you now, in the darkness and the quiet. Let the Norman church with its low chancel arch settle around you. Let the medieval barn with its thick walls and its smell of old timber close about you. Let the Saxon nave with its tiny windows enfold you in its cool and ancient dark. These are not ruins, they are records. They are the physical memory of human bodies that lived and moved and breathed in this place. Bodies that were smaller than yours, bodies that were shaped by conditions you will never know, bodies that built these walls and these doorways and these floors to fit themselves. They got it right. For their bodies, in their time, these spaces were exactly what they needed. The ceiling was the right height. The door was the right size. The world fit. And now you are here, your larger body, in their smaller space. And the fit is just slightly off. And in that slight wrongness, that small but real displacement, you can feel the distance between your life and theirs. It is not a sad feeling, it is a true one. And truth, even quiet truth, even the truth of a doorway, is something to rest in. Sleep now. The stones will be here in the morning. And so, in all the ways that matter, will the people who built them. There is one last place we should visit before we rest completely. It is a place that most people drive past without stopping, a place without a visitor centre or an entry fee or a car park sign. It is a ruined farmhouse in the north of England, somewhere in the limestone country of the Yorkshire Dales. Its walls still standing to shoulder height, but its roof long gone, its hearth exposed to the sky, its doorway open to the wind. The ruin dates probably from the 17th century. It was built on the foundations of an older building, which was itself built on the foundations of something older still. The land around it has been farmed for at least 1,000 years. The stone of the walls came from the same limestone pavement that surrounds it, quarried and shaped by the hands of people who understood this land with an intimacy that most of us will never know. The doorway of this ruined house stands at 5 feet 8 inches. It is a precise measurement of the body of the person who built it, or more probably, of the average of the bodies of the community that built it together. The neighbours who came to help with the raising of the walls and the setting of the lintels, as communities did in the 17th century when a new farmhouse was going up. 5 feet 8 inches. An average 17th century Yorkshire farmer, probably a man. Probably someone who had grown up in this valley, eating what this valley produced, who had been moderately well nourished without ever being well fed, who had worked hard since childhood, and whose body showed the marks of that work in its compact and capable dimensions. He or she built this door. He or she walked through it 10,000 times, in the early mornings of lambing season and the late evenings of harvest, in the cold of January and the warmth of June, coming in from the moor and going out to the animals, coming home and going to work, doing the ordinary daily business of a life lived in this place. And the door fit. The door was right. The world was sized for that body, and that body moved through its world with the ease of fit, with the unremarkable comfort of a person in a space made for them. Now you stand at that doorway, and the fit is different. The door is lower than you expect. The opening is narrower than you are used to. You pause, as you must, and bend your head, and for a moment you are in the frame of another person's life, touching the boundary of another person's world. That is where we rest. In the doorway, between then and now, between their body and yours, between a world that fit them and a world that fits you, it is a good place to stop. It is a good place to sleep. A note on what we have travelled through. We began in the Iron Age, in the low entrances of the roundhouses that dotted the British landscape before the Romans came. We moved through the Roman occupation, the Saxon kingdoms, the Norman conquest, the medieval centuries, the Tudor and Stuart periods, the Industrial Revolution, and into the modern age. At each stage, we paused at a doorway. We looked at its dimensions. We thought about the body it was built for. We felt, as precisely as a non-specialist can feel it, the distance between that body and our own. The Iron Age roundhouse door, barely 5 feet, built to keep out the Dartmoor wind. The Saxon church at Escombe, 5 feet 6, built from Roman rubble by 7th century Northumbrians. The Norman chapel in the Welsh Marches, 5 feet 9, serving a community of medieval farmers. The medieval longhouses of Dartmoor, 5 feet 4 to 5 feet 7, housing the agricultural poor. The Cistercian monastery doorways, 5 feet 8 to 6 feet, fitted to the bodies of well-fed monks. The Tudor great houses, 6 feet and above for the wealthy, lower for the poor. The Georgian terraces, 6 feet 6, built to an aesthetic of elegant proportion. The Victorian terraces, 6 feet to 6 feet 2, rising with the slow improvement of working-class nutrition. The Edwardian house, 6 feet 2 to 6 feet 4, fed by school meals and sanitary reform. The post-war council house, 6 feet 4 to 6 feet 6, built for the beneficiaries of the welfare state. The modern building, 6 feet 7 and above, built for bodies that have grown beyond anything the medieval mason could have imagined. This is the trajectory. This is what doorways record. Not kings and battles, not treaties and constitutions, but the slow biological fact of bodies growing in response to better conditions. The quiet revolution of nutrition and public health that has transformed the British body over the course of the last 2 centuries. The old doors are still standing. They hold, in their stone and oak and brick, the precise measure of other lives. They are patient with us, these old doors. They do not mind that we have to duck. They do not resent our larger bodies or our different dimensions. They are simply what they are, the record of what we were, preserved in the material of the places we built and the heights we chose for our thresholds. We have grown. The doors remember what we were before. Sleep, and let the old buildings hold the memory for you. They are very good at holding things. Coda, the door that is always open. There is a doorway in the ruins of Whitby Abbey in North Yorkshire that frames the sea. The abbey was founded in 657 CE by the Saxon abbess Hild on the cliff above the town where the River Esk meets the North Sea. It was a place of great significance in the early Christian history of Britain, the site of the Synod of Whitby in 664 that determined the date of Easter for the English Church, a decision whose implications echoed across the history of Western Christianity. The abbey was dissolved by Henry VIII, and its buildings gradually fell into ruin, their stone quarried by the townspeople for generations afterward. What remains is a magnificent and haunting skeleton, the great arches of the north wall of the nave still standing against the sky, The east end of the choir preserved to most of its original height. There is a doorway in this ruin, one of the original archways of the medieval building, that now opens onto nothing. Where there was once a wall and a room and a floor and a ceiling, there is now only sky. The doorway stands complete, its arch still springing from its jambs, its moulding still legible in the eroded stone. But it frames, instead of an interior, the open air above the cliff and the grey shimmer of the sea. This doorway is around 6 feet tall, a medieval opening from the 13th century, when the abbey was rebuilt in the Gothic style. The monks who built it were building a passage from one part of their cloister to another, a practical opening in a practical wall. They could not have imagined that one day their wall would be gone and their doorway would open onto the North Sea. But there it is, a door that leads nowhere, or rather, that leads everywhere, that opens onto the largest and most indifferent of spaces, that frames the horizon and the sky and the sea. Standing before this doorway, you might think about all the things that doorways frame when they are working as intended. The room beyond, the garden beyond, the street beyond, the church beyond. You might think about what it means to be inside and what it means to be outside and what it means to stand at the threshold between them. And you might think about all the people who passed through this particular doorway when it was a working door, when there was a room on the other side and the passage from one part of the monastery to another. Those people are gone. The room is gone. The wall is gone. But the doorway remains, holding its shape against the sky, preserving its dimensions, recording in its height and width the size of the bodies that passed through it 800 years ago. The monks of Whitby Abbey were not tall people. The doorway tells you this. They were people of their time, of their nutrition, of their world, and their world produced bodies of a certain size, and they built their doors to fit those bodies, and now the doors stand against the sky. 6 feet of medieval stone framing eternity. This is what Britain's oldest doorways are, at their most essential. They are the measure of lost bodies. They are the physical record of people who lived and died in this place, and left, in the stone they cut, and the wood they hung, and the lintels they set, the precise evidence of their physical existence. You cannot bring those bodies back. You cannot know, from any record, the particular height of the particular monk who passed through this particular door on a particular morning in the 13th century, on his way from the cloister to the chapter house, his mind on his prayers or his administrative duties or the coldness of the sea wind coming up from the cliff. But you can stand at the doorway and know that someone of a certain height passed through it, and you can feel, in the relationship between the doorway and your own body, exactly how far you are from that height, exactly how much has changed between that morning and this one. It is a very small kind of knowledge, but it is a true one. And truth, even small truth, even the truth of a doorway, is worth carrying to the end. Rest now. Britain's oldest doorways have been standing for a very long time. They will stand a little longer.